Hello and welcome to What Am I Rolling, a twice monthly RPG one-shot podcast with me, Fiona. Or normally it is. Welcome back to the final installment of our Worldbuilding series. It's been 5 episodes so far. We're going to finish on number 6 because that is 30 days. We're doing 5 prompts per episode. Just a reminder, we're using the book The Complete Worldbuilding, an author's step-by-step guide to building fictional worlds by Angeline Trevina. It's been very good to keep coming back to it and shape it and stuff like that. And I know I had a couple of people messaging me saying they've been really enjoying it. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's a bit unusual to some of the other things we've been doing here on this channel. I'm also not sure what I would do with this setting once we've completed it, to be honest with you. I know people have been wondering, would I run a game set in it and stuff like that? And the answer is I don't know. Like I said, it's more of a way to sort of think these things through. Yeah, I don't know is the answer. But it's been so far a good experience. But we've not done the last 5 days yet, so we'll see where we go from here. So far we've looked at genre and setting. We've kind of set it in late 1880s, early 1890s, using London, specifically the Isle of Dogs as our sort of basis. We've drawn on inspirations from Buffy, Angel, Veronica Mars, Agent Carter for the mystery investigation themes that we've got going on. Hellboy, Suicide Squad, Misfits, that idea of the supernatural, people having everyday superpowers. I think even like maybe The Boys could be an example here as well. We've looked at some systems, this is something I've included in, or where this setting could be placed. I was thinking like Monster of the Week, Vasan, Hunter the Reckoning, The Between, Vampire, The Masquerade, Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold, Blades in the Dark as a big inspiration as well. And then I wrote some principles for myself, like what is it if I wanted to sell the setting to somebody else, what is it in a nutshell, so to speak? I put 3 things down here. The undead need the help of the living. Fighting and violence is always a last resort. And then there is some fishing. There's a little bit of like Dredge the video game, which is like an eldritch fishing game. Again, I appreciate not everyone has played it, but what I like about that particular game is that there's very thematic. All the people you meet, there's a sort of coldness to them. And so it could be interesting to sort of look at that game, look at similar games, maybe like Encryption as well, that card game, and taking those vibes and those sort of little bit of weirdness to some of the NPCs we could create. Day 2 was drawing of a map, which I kind of cheated, as I always say. We've just taken the Isle of Dogs map, and we have expanded it through the 30 days as we've gone through it. It's not true to size as the current modern-day Isle of Dogs, but we do have stuff like, we mapped out the water sources that we did on day 3. We thought about some capital buildings, essentially, like places of interest on day 4, what the landscape was like, day 5, natural resources, including horse breeders in Mudshoot Park, and the trade at the wharf is sort of like what got the whole sort of thing going. I think this is the early sort of suggestion, that idea of the wharfs being a part of the trading hub. This is a big trading hub with the river, and then we've got lots of different docks and wharfs that people can go and investigate in or go and hide stuff in. Day 7 talked about sapient species, and like I pretty much said it as that sort of alternate history. It is London, but not as we know it, that sort of thing. Human, mostly, is what I've got here, with about 15% of the Isle's population being undead, which could be quite claustrophobic, could be quite terrifying. Well, I say undead, it says reanimated corpses here, ghosts, ghouls, etc., and small aquatic folklore creatures, because we've got the river next to us. The river, aka our version of the Thames, the way that the water circles this particular isle, there's something in it so that it traps anything dead on the isle. No other undead can get in, so no vampires, no flying creatures probably can't get in, and nobody can get out. We did talk about whether some bodies had been dumped elsewhere, and maybe there's a great deal of pain as well. One thing to mention, and I know I mentioned it later on, is that we do have the Greenwich Tunnel, this sort of foot tunnel that connects the Isle to the local district of Greenwich as well, and that there's rumours of having ghosts, marauders, or a gang of some sort that are trapped within the tunnel itself. Day 8 was all about food. God, we love food, don't we? Talking about like the exports and imports, and that's where the sort of fishing stuff came along. There's illegal fishing along the Thames, and then we sort of made up this whole thing about fishing being a part of the culture, like, give a man a fish, he eats for the day, but if you teach him to fish, he eats for life, that sort of thing. And that idea of having wedding customs based upon fish and anniversaries, which I still quite like, I think that's quite fun. And then we kind of made up that there's a floating fish market just out on the river itself, constantly moving, but always getting raided, and there's some sort of criminal activity down there as well. Day 9 talked about farmed animals. Literally, we had treated as cattle, nothing special. Again, this particular isle itself, there isn't much import in terms of animals because the landscape itself is not necessarily right for growing. It's quite compact, this place, so we can't necessarily have free range, hens, chickens, calves, etc. Everything has a means to an end, that sort of thing. Everything is used. We've talked about this idea of the smog as well, that the smog affects the quality of the meat and any sort of cattle markets and stuff like that. So that sort of smog factor is factored into the price point as well. We had stuff about natural predators, so that idea of vermin being all the way around. And again, I put in a point about unnatural predators, and this point being serial killers, possibly the police, and the undead as well. We talked about weather and climate in day 11, that idea that the weather itself is controlled by marshal-appointed scientists and hot air balloons, and having these alchemicalists that just throw potions into the air and seeing the chemicals combine in the air. We can predict the weather patterns and people can vote for what they like, but it's completely rigged as a result. Which led into a lot of interesting thoughts about the wharfs themselves having the means to have custom-produced umbrellas as sort of marketing for their clients to come and pick them up as they were going to go out and inspect their goods, which I really like. Day 12 was travel and trade routes. We talked about most people will be walking around here. There are Hanson cabs around the A road. There is this monorail replacement going on. It used to be very similar to the what I know as the Emirates line. There's sort of capsules being slowly sort of dragged out of a line from Canary Wharf all the way to Greenwich. But it has been slowly replaced by this monorail and having a stop created in a place called Cross Harbour. It's basically becoming more and more important that people need to visit these places, but they need it for convenience. So it's not necessarily for the convenience of the workers, it's for the convenience of the merchants. Any clients are coming in from out of these areas into the Isle itself. We also talked about this idea of mech suits helping to move the resources off the boats onto probably smaller boats or to loaders that are pulled by horses. I love this idea of the mech suits. It makes me feel very much like Alien and Ripley, facing off and stuff. So maybe that could be a thing, people facing off in these mech suits afterwards. We also talked on day 13 about important trade towns, which I sort of took to mean important wharfs that are used for docks, and a mixture of sort of wharfs and docks that would come up in play. So I got a couple of interesting ones here that are both a mixture of real and fictional. Day 14 was education. And we decided that your sex and gender is no barrier to education, but all of it is a means to an end. It is to prepare you for a practical life working in the docks. So, physical education is prioritized, but also math and English, anything to do with sums, because that's what people need. It's a business. There's less priority or less sort of appreciation of the arts. I mean, God, what's new, eh? What was interesting was that the undead here, knowledge about them was sort of underground, so to speak. There's whispers at the family home, maybe some underground leanings, but basically what we find out going through these next couple of days is that everyone is afraid of the dead. Even if we have stuff in terms of class divides or gender divides, I don't think we do. No matter what, everyone is against the dead. Even religious groups, which again we talk about a little bit later. Again, there's no sort of conflict between them per se, which I know sounds a bit simplistic, but for now, for ease, they're all united in their sort of fear of the undead, even though they have maybe different interpretation of life after death and maybe reincarnation, etc., etc. Law and Order on day 15, we kind of talked it down to sort of marshals. Again, I'm very bad at coming up with actual names. I think that's the thing about this particular setting, is that it's okay just to throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, etc. I'm sure I could come up with a much better name than marshals and the marshal. We did nail down what kind of government is happening on the isle itself. This idea of there's a council of 5, with one of them possibly being undead, but we don't know which one. A council of 5 and having one person being almost like a lord, basically copying and pasting what the UK government is just now. That idea of one marshal that reports to a House of Lords, and then the council itself is more like MPs for the Houses of Commons. We talked about the royal family as well on day 16 as part of the government structure. So I made it a matriarchy, because why the hell not? This idea that we came across, this idea of the royal family's line has been almost stretched thin because of the magical protection that they've insisted on putting on themselves through some various paranoid means, perhaps. As a result, has mutated that line so that when they do pass, they become immortal, but they become immortal undead, ghouls, etc. We've talked about this history. The origination of the royal family is this idea that they have the sight to see into the future. Maybe they were the first monster hunters to unite all these districts. And maybe they encourage these monster hunts, this idea of like a purging, a fox hunting almost, which may still happen in other districts. Monarchy is still a ceremonial position, a moral authority, that sort of idea of the light against the dark. But as soon as someone higher up disappears from view, that is it, they are not spoken about because it is assumed that they have died, and nobody wants to be the one to point out that perhaps they haven't gone completely. I did think we also talked about the idea that a wedding had been called off or there'd been an exodus of some sort recently, which could be, again, another story hook that we could put in later on if the people were playing this game. Day 17 was all about economics. It is a capitalist society. We have our currency of farthings, pennies, shillings, crowns, pounds, and the guinea. Our housing itself is cramped. I mean, what's the difference between modern London? I think the main thing to remember is that if the river is cut off or there's a big drought, as there could possibly be, depending on the weather stuff, an economic crash will absolutely happen in that district because all the wharfs rely on the boats coming in. They rely on the merchants docking and undocking and customs and all that sort of thing. So if we don't have a means for them to get in easily, then they'll go somewhere else, which could be quite the storyline if something happened to the weather machines, perhaps. Day 18 was family groups. How important is the family? And again, we sort of made it so that it doesn't matter if it's blood related or found family. People come together. They're in close proximity to each other. Their groups will be found. There's no rules on marriage. People can be with whoever they want as long as it's consensual. Divorce is structured, black and white, but it may be still painful for those in the process. But most importantly, the celebration of life events and death. Again, people do celebrate, but anything death-related, funerals or something, there is a fear that those who have passed may return and may be stuck here unless you celebrate it and remember people. That idea of remembrance, I think, is quite key here, and that people are scared. We talked about this thing in Asian cultures where we remember the ancestors and stuff, but I just imagine this idea of like you're going up someone's stairs and every single one of the pictures, the tiny, tiny portraits, are of those, I don't know what the official term is, but the sort of Victorian death photos where they have the bodies all sort of propped up, eyes sewn shut, etc. So you can remember who they are at the moment of passing. On day 19, we had gender roles, which was quite easy for me. Gender equality for all, frankly. Doesn't matter who you are or what you identify as, it is about what you do that matters. Are you going to pull your weight at the dock? Are you going to help solve the mystery? Great, get in here, we need you now. It has always been a practical thing. More forward, practical approach to things. There's no need to have flowery words and promises. We are just quite down to earth and getting on with things. But mostly the dock workers, who probably make up the majority of the working class, they are more practical and they just assess things in those practical terms, and so therefore they don't necessarily have a creative approach or wanting to think too much about things, which is both good and bad, I guess, thinking of gender roles, and in terms of employment as well. People move here to get contracts, to get work in physical labour. It is quite lucrative. It is incredibly hard. You're probably working really hard hours, but everyone gets involved and you make a lot of money from it. We had this idea of unions before, and maybe this idea of those mech suits play on the idea of like AI. They're starting to take off in quite a big way, and as a result the workers are trying to fight back a little bit, trying to protect themselves from any abuse at work in terms of their rights, any financial stuff as well. But also, there was this talk before about maybe some underhanded things. So when there is strike action, the wharfs do have a bit of power because they have means for an undead workforce. Only one of them, I can't remember which one we said was the case, but ooh, tricky. On day 21, we had the class divide and social mobility questions, that upper, middle and working class, indicating the levels of working labour on the Isle, as we translated it as like merchants, business agents and dock workers themselves. It is strictly segregated, and it's probably quite hard to break through to the next divide, the next class, but that said, it is not impossible. The only thing is that anyone at any time could fall from grace to be in the other group, which no one talks about, which is the undead, the secret fear of them. This idea, again, I've talked about it before, this sort of ancient times sort of superstition about the undead, with the rise of the penny dreadfuls, printing press, with this whole purge thing as well, the monster hunts, etc. Day 22 was actually a fun one. It was talking about religious and spiritual belief systems. As we said before, the capital itself is a big melting pot of all these different faiths and religions, each with their own denominations. There are various places of worship. All are welcome to practice. All the faith leaders, I've said here, meet up, and it's more of a philosophical debate, agree to disagree, trying to think things through and help people who are asking for it. It's not enshrined into law, but it's not at odds with it. The only thing we said is there may be a little bit of conflict if a new religion does come up with strong views for the protection of the undead or for enshrining their rights in some way. Day 23 was magic, which we translated it as scientific magic, not magic. We drew on the themes of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, that kind of vibe, rather than anything supernatural per se. Again, we talked about the idea of seances, tarot card readings, exorcisms. But I do think if we're taking a little bit from Vason, there is this idea of folklore and theories and fairies and stuff like that. So it's not like magic wands casting fireball, but it is this unknowable thing that not everyone has access to. There are a few chosen people, going back to that idea of like misfits and people with superpowers. And that, in my head, leads on to what the players in the setting will be. They are going to be investigators. They're going to be solving unusual crimes, that sort of Sherlock Holmes with a little dash of sort of Rivers of London, finding things out and maybe trying to solve it and maybe trying to bring peace to it, with the focus being on the undead, maybe fighting in their corner, maybe being like lawyers almost, trying to protect them. Day 24 was about festivals and celebrations. We went through a whole list of kind of the different festivals at the family level, at the sort of national level and international level, sort of. The only thing we sort of really hit on, perhaps, is that this idea that always a day off for everyone, with the clocks going forward and back, this idea of rituals or clockmakers. Faiths festivals were celebrated, but unfortunately they weren't paid off time no matter what. So Christmas, for example, wasn't a enshrined day off, but there was things like the last week of December and first week of January. It was so cold that the river itself would freeze, so then the workers would have to take time off for that because there was no work. And yes, I've got it here. I said monster hunts before, but I've got it here down as the undead hunt has been outlawed in quotation marks. And then finally, our last prompt before today's episode, it was technology. I've put it here that in this particular aisle, there's a hodgepodge of technology. We've got the gas, we've got the electric, we've got steam, we've got a horse, animal-powered stuff. The monorail is almost like a metaphor for the new development happening. There's also the unexplained. Like, I'm not going to go into detail about how they change the weather in the hot air balloons. Ultimately, the thing is that people are time poor. They don't have the resources to necessarily strive and flourish. They have to make great big sacrifices if they want to follow through with something. This idea of steam power and electric is worrisome in a way because it could replace manual jobs, the physical labour jobs. And again, I've talked a bit here about striking and using the undead workforce instead. So there you go. That was sort of me rattling through our sort of recap of stuff. We've got lots of stuff there. And again, I know I've said this already. It would be good to rewrite this later, maybe like in a month's time or something like that, and go through and like, what can I expand, what doesn't work anymore, etc. All right, let's get started with the final couple of prompts. We're going to look at day 26 all the way through to day 30. Let's begin. Day 26, medicine. Just like technology, it's not necessarily the case historic worlds have lesser knowledge or advancement than we do today. They might have a different understanding of things and knowledge far better than ours. They might practice medicine based on religion or use natural remedies. They might use magic or music or chanting or hypnosis. They might use lasers or cloning or 3D printing. Beyond thinking about the basis of scientific and medical knowledge, you also need to think about its place in society. Do different groups of people use different forms of medicine? And what would happen if someone fell ill in another area, where medicine was totally different? Can everyone access medicine? Perhaps some will rush to their local state-of-the-art hospital, whilst others will have to turn to an elder in the village. Maybe conventional medicine is incredibly expensive. perhaps alternative therapies suddenly grow in popularity, pushing up the prices of what was once a cheap local choice. Who can practice medicine? Is there a world where local midwives and wise women have to live under the radar, fearful of being found out? Is it a world where women can rise quickly through the ranks of the medical field? Where training and qualifications in medicine are subsidised by the government and taught in universities that actively seek to recruit students from disadvantaged backgrounds? Ooh, what a great question. I think, because this is sort of the age of people opening up bodies in lecture theatres, those sort of anatomical drawings of like people, open autopsies that lots of people would attend. It's that sort of era, that sort of Victoriana, Edwardian sort of like checking things through. So 100%, that's the vibe I'm thinking of that. Basically, medicine, it's not as advanced as nowadays. It is of the 1880, 1890 standards. Like, I find it fascinating that they would do that, like in a lecture hall, that they would bring someone in and open stuff, and everyone would there looking as almost like a, like a peanut gallery looking down. So yes, I think university level, you'd have to go for it there to be trained as a doctor for these sort of areas. I think there would be like maybe one or two, I'm going to call them GP surgeries, but I think one or two like medical outposts for sure. But I don't think it is as well staffed or well stocked. Yeah, I don't think it's as well stocked. So I think one or two GP surgeries or outposts where you could get medical attention from. Yeah, I don't think there would be a hospital on the Isle. You'd have to travel to, say, Greenwich if you needed to go to hospital, which then obviously is a worrisome thing, I guess, because if you're close to death and maybe there's a chance to change you back so that you have to get across the water ASAP. So maybe you have, instead of like horse and cart ambulances, you have boats that can take you across the water as well if you don't want to chance the foot tunnel. I think what I'm getting at is that medicine is more scientific than holistic. We're going to make you better, or we're going to find out what's wrong with you, even if you might not survive the process. You know what I mean? But that said, I do feel that there is like a folklore, there'll be beads, there'll be water, there'll be, the snake oil merchant, there'll be someone, Mr. Pepper's pills. They contain nothing harmful to health, but they increase your libido, they increase hair growth, and they make you thinner and more voluptuous, and contain 4 out of your 5 recommended food groups a day. That sort of fake advertising. I love that idea that there is somebody that is like out there on a horse and wagon selling their wares which absolutely do nothing. They're all placebo-like medicines and tinctures and pills. I think there'll be like old wives' tales about like, well, if you pick a certain plant, like a dock leaf, then, it will get the needles out, etc. So I think every household will have like a medicine kit that is filled with various herbs and lotions of various qualities and from the natural world. These are natural remedies. That's what I'm thinking of. Everyone will have a natural remedies herbal kit at home. So it would ease, she says in quotation marks, the pain, but it probably won't help the individual out too much. I love the idea of music being used in some way. It's almost like the power of prayer, I think, is the thing when it's talking about there. So maybe, I think we said this before, at every wharf we have a prayer room, a faith room that people can use. I wonder if every dock has a doctor online, but also has somebody that does the natural remedies as well. And unfortunately, maybe you have to pay to get, depending on, or not pay, maybe you have to take a cut in your salary depending on which one you have to use. So a mixture of like, I'll chew on this leaf and see me tomorrow, or I'm going to write you this prescription of smoking cigarettes, and I'm trying to work it out what I say. Yeah, I think maybe there's 2 levels that are offered at every dock that is enshrined into the workers' rights. But if you're going to use the more scientific one, maybe you're going to have to take a cut in your salary or something. Can everyone access medicine? Yes, I think so. I think it's just the standard of care might be a bit tricky. Like, I don't think midwives and wise women are under the radar. Frankly, I'm not going to have... we can't have any female doctors. Nah, sod that. There's plenty of female doctors. Perhaps they have more gruesome autopsies as a result that they perform the most gruesome autopsies. Maybe it's seen it as a little bit unladylike in some way, perhaps. no matter where you come from in life, no matter your gender, your race, etc., anyone can study medicine. But I wonder if there's more, let's say, human testing on the undead as a result. I hadn't even thought of that idea that, we need to get rid of them. Like, we talked about these punishment things before. How do we get rid of the undead before? And I think they're used for scientific testing as a result. Oof, horrible. And maybe autopsies on the ones that aren't claimed to work out how they're still alive, and they're in a great lot of pain as a result. Oh, that's gone really gothic, really horrible, really quickly. Amazing. I've put down here, the undead are guinea pigs. Whoa, horrible. Yeah, no matter what walk of life you have come from, you can be a doctor. For example, if you were a dock worker previously, maybe you would take some time out to go and study and maybe have those placements and learn on the job how to heal injuries quickly, set bones, any broken bones quickly, etc. Maybe there's a lot of on-the-spot learning, perhaps, which then you could use to get into being the standby doctor in your particular wharf instead. Cool. I think that's all I have for it, actually. I think we've got a good sense of what we want. So yeah. All right, day 27, weaponry. What weapons exist in your world? Perhaps your characters fight with swords and axes, attacking on horseback or on foot. Perhaps they use guns, tanks, bombs. Maybe they just use magic or laser guns. Weaponry in your world will be closely connected to the level of technology that you're introducing. But what happens if an army invades with a different level of technology, a different kind of weaponry? Who has access to weapons? Who has the training to wield them? Maybe there are weapons that have been banned or weapons that can be illegally adapted. Maybe there are weapons that can no longer be used because the knowledge or the ability to use them has been lost. Think about how weaponry links to your society. Do they favour one weapon over another? What restrictions or features of your world have forced this choice? What skills and talents of your people? Also, consider society's attitudes towards weapons. Are they carried openly or concealed? Are the military a common sight in the city, or are they rarely seen? Think about whether your police are armed and what proportion of the general public are. Do people act with surprise when they see weapons, or are they an everyday sight? Oh, again, another good question. I think I'm going to make it simple. We'll just use what we have in the UK, is that the public is not allowed to arm themselves with weaponry. It is something that the marshals, the police enforcement do have, or maybe the Royal Guard also has as well. So that is maybe an assumption we're going to keep for the rest. So not the general public, but certain law enforcement / guard force does have weaponry. We talked about the technology beforehand, this idea of a mixture of steam, electricity, etc. So I think undeniably, because we're going for almost like a pulp adventure type setting, guns will have to be a thing. I think mostly like pistols, which can be concealed either under a coat or maybe in a well-designed pocket of a dress, perhaps. But I also think maybe the older generation would have access to like a sword or something like that, but they're harder to disguise. Maybe the odd sharp knife or something like that as well. That said, I wonder if weaponry, what we're thinking about here, we kind of have like almost like a Victorian, Edwardian version of tasers, perhaps, to subdue individuals, not only sort of rioting, so human, mortal individuals, but maybe the undead as well, having them contained in like an electric force field, perhaps. So I think an Edwardian type taser and maybe like a ghost trap from Ghostbusters of some sort as well, to make things a little stand out on the spectrum of weaponry. And I think as well, those particular weaponry that are powered by electricity, because we're going through this transformation and stuff, maybe it is all unpredictable. It's not really tested. So there's a massive chance that these things can backfire. So they are super powerful, but at the same time, they might be so powerful that they blow up or ricochet back onto the person using it. I think other than the guards and marshals, I don't think there's any training. Again, maybe out in the countryside away from the capital, maybe there is like clay pigeon shooting, that sort of like, hunting for sport, hunting like that. But that is, again, using the older weapons and stuff. And it's seen as a sport, like a fun pastime, rather than like, to kill, to eat, etc. So yeah, I don't think there's any training one could take unless they were in the law enforcement era, or they maybe are rich enough to have time off to collect, guns and to do some hunting on their own grounds, perhaps. So as a result, I think it is unusual when people pull weapons on each other and it's a surprise, like it's an escalation. There's a lot of talking involved, but I wonder if it goes into fisticuffs, perhaps, rather than weaponry, because once a weapon is out, then that is it's a statement, right? It's a big thing to do. And everyone will see you've got a electric taser that comes out if you're going to use it on someone. I wonder if... I know I keep going back to these hot air balloons, but maybe they have some sort of air support military stuff where they can shoot down other hot air balloons, other encroaching sort of armies. I don't think there's tanks or anything like that, but I don't think there's planes necessarily yet. Or at least not the ones I'm thinking of, in the sort of 1920s all the way to the 1950s. They're not those sort of air support like that, but I think it's very difficult to invade a place like that. It's very difficult to travel to unless you're on ships. So maybe there's like anti-ship military guns are in strategic places around the Isle that haven't been used in such a long time due to this being a peaceful time just now, but they could be readied and get ready to sink any unwanted invading force via the sea. I do like the idea, and what's coming back to me now is like chitty chitty bang bang, this idea of a flying car being seen as an invading force to a country. Maybe that could be what it is. There's rumours of flying vehicles, but in that same thing of like, they could turn into water vehicles, they could turn into flying vehicles. And it's just, I like that idea. It's almost wholesome, but it could be quite scary to have suddenly like a flying car that descends and then drives along the town. Because I don't think we talked about, there's no cars. We've not put any cars here. It is all Hansom cabs and horses. So yeah, having a flying car that could then turn into an actual car and then like a water vehicle as well could be quite terrifying. But the rumours from other places, maybe France or Germany, have these places that they're building them now. And that's the rumour. What a wild turn. I didn't think we'd be talking about Chitty Chitty Bang Bang in this, I'll be honest. The only thing to add to this, I wonder, maybe there is like an illegal underground market of weapons where they have been tampered with and legally adapted, hence why we have these untested and unreliable things. Maybe I don't think the undead would have anything like that, to be honest with you, but I think there is an underground market. Maybe because people want to be kept safe from the undead and they're buying into these, weaponry to keep them safe at night and keep their families safe at night. Equally, if we're going back to the fishing thing, maybe they're also buying bait and weaponry to like kill off any unusual eldritch fish that might be brought up. A safe and quick kill rather than risking their own lives. I think that's it. I don't think we need anything else. Day 28. Historic wars. Everything in your world is shaped by its past. What scars remain from wars fought in your world? What monuments and reminders are there? It may be streets named after famous generals or battles. It may be cities built around a central war memorial. It might be towns with very few men left. War can change huge things in your world. Borders, governments, languages, religions, freedoms. It can bring slavery, new technologies, an influx of immigrants, or an outpouring of refugees who then become immigrants elsewhere. Think about the historic wars that have happened in your world, the effect they have had, and the reminders that remain. Also, consider the attitudes of the society towards these wars. Are they spoken about with a general sense of pride, or are they whispered about shamefully? Are people still angry or mourning? How are soldiers treated, and how are the injured soldiers treated? How about those who desert or get discharged? Well, with any sort of pulp setting like this, and especially if we're basing it on London, I think the wider country definitely would have had the historic wars, maybe right up until the end of the 19th century. I'm just looking on Wikipedia now, and there are so many wars that happened in the 1800s, even like fitting it down to like the 1880s to 1890s, end of 1890s. There were so many. That is, again, I didn't know this. It's quite shocking in a way. But I think if we're having those ideas, there's lots of little skirmishes from what I understand from far off places. Again, this is just me looking at the list, like stuff like the Boer Wars, all that sort of thing. I think we can keep that in mind, that a lot of this stuff, certainly with the UK involved, was probably colonial, quashing uprisings and stuff. So I think, taking that in mind, if we take that blueprint, that currently it is a time of peace for this country, that doesn't mean that there is no wars going on at all elsewhere. And in that case, then, there is a sense of pride, a national pride, about the wars that we've taken part in, about the ones we won, in quotation marks, for sure. I think the reason why I say that is because I think at this time you would hear news of these wars happening, but they weren't at home. They're not as widely reported about or wildly televised as they are now for us, that where we can get news about any sort of conflict within 24 hours. If you Google, if you look online, here you wouldn't get the news back for many months perhaps. And because it was not close to home, it didn't matter too much. I think people just don't understand what these wars were for and what they were doing, even though they weren't good and a lot of suffering. And again, as it's sort of indicating, the sort of rise of possibly slavery, immigrants, refugees, that sort of thing, becoming connected to those wars. There's definitely war memorials for sure, and they're probably decorated or talked about on days of when we remember these things. So, I'm thinking of the equivalent of a Memorial Day or a Remembrance Day of some sort. I don't think there's any sort of famous landmarks or anything like that. If anything, the only sort of things we would have on display would be stuff we have taken from our enemies as a victory thing, as a reward for winning. So basically, I'm thinking of when the UK, England, Britain stole artifacts of great historic value from other countries and then put them on display in museums. I think an interesting question here is how are soldiers treated, or how injured soldiers are treated. Let's see if we can turn this back to our main thing of the undead. So I think they're treated as heroes. There's our boys are doing so well. And then when they come back, any losses is understandable. It's hard on the loved ones, but it is an honour to fight for Queen and country. But I don't think there's much for them when they come back. They've obviously been changed by the warfare, by what they've seen, but there's no capacity. I think, we talked about the medicine before, we've only mentioned physical health. We haven't mentioned mental health at all. So I think shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder is quite common with soldiers returning from these wars. I think a lot of stuff that happens, which is quite common, I think they become unhoused. There's nowhere for them to go. And then I think maybe there's an intermingling with the undead in some way, maybe something there, perhaps? Because these soldiers are sort of left out in the cold, just as the undead are. So maybe the ones that are brought back, maybe they're either confined to hospital wards because they're struggling with poor mental health and there's no cure for it, or if they're left out in the cold, the only place they can go is the undead, because the undead can't judge them, even though there must be a state of fear, perhaps. I wonder if this undead stuff happens in other countries. Maybe an unknown country currently has undead armies that they use to fight, and in the most recent of wars, it's becoming more and more again, it's feeding into that whole us versus them against the undead, that they must have had something to do with it, even though it is absolutely not our undead. But maybe those soldiers who have interacted with the undead on the battlefield, coming back, maybe there's a mixture of fear of having the memories triggered again and again, having the trauma triggered again and again, but also realizing that they are just like us. They're also disadvantaged, they are also scared and don't want to be in this place. But I like the idea of an undead army being used by a different foreign power. Maybe, again, just thinking about it, maybe they bring back certain diseases that they've contracted on the battlefield, maybe an unknown parasite or something that is sent back and to kill people, and then they die and turn into undead. That could be something as well. It's like a new sort of chemical warfare that directly targets living people to change them into the undead, to sort of play on that fear and prejudice against undead individuals. I think any soldiers who are physically injured, they are given more support to get them back into society and get them back into the workforce, the labour stuff. So there is access to prosthetics, there is access to mobility aids, that sort of thing, to get people on the feet. It's those who show poor mental health or mental diseases that can't be cured easily. They're kind of left out in the cold, sort of left under the bus, so to speak, which again feels very, weirdly relevant right now. I don't know. How about those who desert or get discharged? Well, I think ultimately they're frowned upon. They're not serving the country, they're not forwarding our gains, they're not protecting us, so they are cowards. You know, the pacifist attitude rubs people up the wrong way, certainly on the Isle itself, I think. Yeah, let's keep it at that, I think. That there has been quite a lot of warfare in the past, and with this rising amount of technologies and stuff, there is a fear that's happening, but people are very proud to serve for their country and protect the royal family line. But all the wars are so far away, they're not reported on, but we have evidence of such wars because we have trophies in our various museums. I think that works. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say on that. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail. It's something I would flesh out later on, but I do like the idea of political intrigue could be interesting. Maybe having undead spies could be something as well. I'm just going to put that in. I don't know if it's going to stick to anything. Working for other nations. It's floating in my head. I don't know if I could connect it to anything, but espionage could be quite a fun one. Maybe they're trying to steal secrets about what is going on with the royal line, perhaps, especially if they had someone that's broken away from it recently. Yeah, I think that's all. I don't have anything else on that. I think, yeah, sounds good. All right. Day 29. Social change and revolution. Your world may have also seen big changes via a rise-up of the people. These don't necessarily have to be violent uprising. There may be policy changes brought about diplomatically, peacefully. What changes has society seen in your world, and how have they been brought about? Did people sacrifice themselves for the greater good, throwing themselves on the sword to bring about change? Or did they fight from the inside, rising up through government to reforge the world? What reminders of these events still remain? Perhaps there are streets named after great protesters or festivals recognizing their sacrifice. Maybe gallows still stand in the city as a warning to those who might start thinking revolutionary thoughts. How have things been changed for your people? What freedoms have been won and lost? Perhaps the revolution is still to come. Yes, interesting. I think there's definitely been more peaceful protesting of things. I think, I'm just trying to make it easy for myself. Like, if we just take history as is, obviously there have been many protests. I think around about this time, you know, the stuff for like the votes for women and all that sort of thing was coming about. But we already have gender equality. That's what I've put in the world. So we wouldn't have any of that per se. I'm going to keep bringing it back to the dead, because I think that's important here. Again, if we're taking history as is and like this alternate history, I think all the way up to the 1880s, we'll just take that as a given. I think the only thing extra I want to talk about or add in necessarily is maybe there's been a rise in pro-undead rights, you know, talking about undead issues and trying to get them recognised as part of this nation rather than forgotten about and discriminated against, frankly. I think since the royal family brought the districts together against those dark forces, maybe hundreds of years ago, maybe now there's a change in attitude, how things have not necessarily changed, like the old views of like, well, the monsters are out to get us. But then we have these undead people who are not to blame for any monstrous activity, that it's something else has happened here. And so the sort of black and white views of stuff needs to change. I think that's the key thing there. So we had this sort of revolutionary bringing together of the capital and all the districts via the royal family being monster hunters. And then maybe slowly but surely over the last 50 years or so, we've been outlawing certain things like these dead hunts, for example. You know, something like that. But there's not been any progress recently on how do we look after the dead? What do we do about it? Because 15% is quite a big number, and it's probably only going to increase and exacerbate certainly situations on the Isle when they can't get off properly. So maybe there are these more peaceful protesting festivals or awareness events of people talking about the undead and, friends of the undead. It's like friends of the ooh, that sort of thing. I'm sure there'll be better friends of the undead. FUD, to be short. Or FOD even, probably. FOD. And I think recently it's gone from peaceful protesting to sort of violent clashes with the marshals. I don't think there's anyone that's been throwing themselves onto the swords or being martyrs, for example. I think people have been doing sort of classic protesting things by, chaining themselves to fences, to each other, blocking access into buildings, being up on building work, holding out banners, that sort of thing. Maybe even doing what, like some of the climate protesters have been doing recently, like throwing oil or paint over certain landmarks, certainly ones that depict maybe the royal family, perhaps, to indicate things need a change. Maybe there's been some clashes at the docks, for example, and that's been an interesting sort of melting pot of a conflict, perhaps, because people are trying to get to work, but they're being blocked because people have chained themselves to the gates. Maybe stuff like breaking into parliament, disrupting political discourse, all those sort of things, to make a point about it. On the other hand, I think there's been a more contentious rising of the dock workers. I think it's related to the stuff about the undead issues. We talked about it before, this like ongoing technology advancing issue, which is starting to replace people's jobs, sort of to automate certain processes. So now the workers are trying to get people to recognize their rights and being able to use these resources ethically and in a way that doesn't impact on their work, a little bit like the writers' strike and the actors' strike we had over a couple of years ago, ensuring that their rights and the access to like equal pay, getting credit where credit's due, and not being replaced by automaton machines, So like capital punishment was still a thing in the UK in the 1880s and 1890s, so I think, the gallows would have been there. And I wonder, maybe there's something similar for undead. Maybe we find a way for the undead to be killed, or find out people who are helping the undead. Maybe that's what it is as well. So I think regardless, capital punishment and gallows is still a big thing, as well as being imprisoned. I do think there is a sort of loyalty to the royal family because they have protected us, in quotation marks. They brought everyone together to fend off the dark, so that we owe them our loyalty. I think that is a general sentiment going around. But as a result, I think people are now starting to have those revolutionary thoughts. Things are starting to change for people as they realise that this can't go on, this can't be sustainable, and we need to do something about it. I think the only thing we had was the undead hunts in terms of festivals that have been mostly outlawed anyway now as a show of the changing of the times, I think. We're currently at like a very tense moment, I think, when we're coming to this story. So I think civil unrest could boil over at any time. So that could be quite exciting, I think, to look at. And here we go, we have made it. Day 30, Other Historic Events. What other events have shaped your world? Volcanoes, earthquakes, climate change, the death of the sun, plagues, invasions, an apocalypse, an extinction. Perhaps something happened that changed the evolution of the land or the people entirely. Maybe something occurred that set the world off on a totally different course. Think about how these events have shaped your world into what it has become. And think about how it has affected the people and their lives. Right. Okay, so I don't think it's anything necessarily climate change related. And I also, this is something I'm quite keen on, I think the undead coming back to life is a recent thing, I think in the last 30 years or so, but I don't think I'm ever going to explain why. And the reason is I don't think it's, again, maybe it's something later on where I'm like, yes, the people using all these chemicals in the air have changed our chemistry and biology, so therefore we're now changed. We're no longer humans. We're actually more alike than the undead, and it's just our next evolution. I mean, that could be an example, but I don't think that's interesting. I always find that it's better to keep the mystery, that this is just a fact of the world and we have to deal with it rather than explain every part of it. That's just my view. And it's the same with horror films. I've spoken about this before, this idea of nightmare logic. Something is scary, but as soon as you explain why it's all happening, it's no longer scary. And so why would you do that in a horror film? Why would you do it in this? So I think I would not give a reason why the undead started coming back to life 30 years ago. Maybe it has something to do with the royal family, for example. Yeah, I don't think there's anything to do with volcanoes or earthquakes, plagues. The only thing I would suggest maybe is that the river in which we are surrounded by, it gets low. Every couple of years, the water gets very low, in which that you can then start to cross it. And so maybe there's been more and more chances of having an economic crash on the Isle. But I think as a result, there may be gaps in the way where the undead from either the Isle or other districts can cross it because it becomes so sparse. Equally, thinking about it, if the river becomes frozen during the really cold winter months for a week or two, maybe there has to be more guards on to stop any undead trying to cross. Because I think it's running water is what I want it to be. That's the reason you can't get across. It's something to do with the running water, but frozen water? Interesting. And we've talked about it earlier, this idea of an upcoming election on the Isle itself with an undead candidate. So I do think that we are in the process of doing historical things just now. So maybe that's the key thing I want to tie into, is that we have all this stuff set up, but then the players are going to have an impact, and those are going to be the historic events. And so such a setting could then be, I can imagine we skip forward until the 1920s or the 1940s. And what we've done here in the 1880s and 1890s will have an impact on those future stories. It will shape around things like that. So maybe that's the way I'm thinking about it in some way. And equally, we could go back as well. Any events that happen, we could go back in time to, say, some of these wars with the undead and work out, have players play those characters and stuff. That could be interesting. The undead hunts are over, and maybe it's because the last one spilt over into actual civil unrest about 10 years ago. People were unhappy and stuff, and it just turned into a night of bloody violence and mess, and as a result, it can never happen again, and it spilled over to various districts, so it's only very regulated hunts or haunts that happen now. Maybe with that undead hunts being licensed and outlawed, maybe one of the reasons the undead is feared a little bit is because they started fighting back. They had actually prepared things, actually strategized about how they were going to deal with people who were just violent mobs. And that was what terrified people, is that they're not just mindless creatures, the undead, they are smart, they're so like us. And so that fear of they're out to kill us, these unnatural predators are going to kill us. Maybe that sort of helped fuel this fear against them today. Well, there you go. That's it. I'm going to read the actual last paragraph now. It says, "Congratulations, you are now a deity in your own right, able to sit back and proudly survey the world that you have created. You've moulded it with your own hands from nothing. You imagined it, and now here it is, fresh and new and wonderful. Look closely. Can you see all those little people walking about down there? They're the important ones, and you're about to give them one hell of an adventure. They are the ones that matter. When you're building your world, you always need to bring it back to the people, how things affect them and their lives. Because that's who your story is about. It's characters. Always remember that you are not writing about a wondrous world in which some characters happen to live. You are writing about wondrous characters who happen to live in a world you've built for them." Indeed. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. There we go. That is the end of our 30 days. There are some bonus lessons we could do about creating a magic system, which I'm not going to do for this particular one, but maybe we'll come back to it. And I will say as well, Angeline Trevino has written so many books about world building. This was the first one in a huge series of them. We have ones like How to Destroy the World, an author's guide to writing dystopia and post-apocalypse. We have From Sanctity to Sorcery, an author's guide to building belief structures and magic systems, so going into real depth about it. There's How to Build a Culture, an author's guide to building rich and diverse cultures. How to Map Your World, an author's guide to mapping fictional worlds. And then her latest book, I believe, has come out, How to Create Dark Worlds, an author's guide to world building, horror, dark fantasy, and grim dark. Excellent. I will definitely be checking those out, because these are more guidebooks and actual sort of like prompts. But there you go. That was the complete world building. This is the Isle that we've created over 30 different prompts. Hard going at times. I think I struggled a little bit, but I very much have enjoyed it. It feels I have something. Like, as it said, like it feels something very precious to me that I've taken the time to make and have to think about stuff. And what is it that I enjoy about worlds? I do think that last sort of paragraph was quite interesting, is that ultimately it is not your world that's important, it's about the characters in it. And that's the same sort of philosophy I have for role-playing games. I've recently read a book called How to Use Proactive Role-Playing Games in Your Games, which we've done for DM's Book Club. We're coming up as an episode shortly. And that has this idea of, like, rather than the GM creating a story and just like having the players in it to affect it a little bit, it's about throwing that agency back at the players, going, okay, so what do you want to do? And knowing what their long-term goals are, and that affects everything else. So I think what I've done here is create a really good world that I could give a quick summary of to the players and be like, okay, ideally you should be investigators, but you might not want to be. What do you want to be in this particular world? Where would you see yourselves fit in? When they create characters and then have their goals, I can then focus more on the different factions. We had the Marshall faction, we had the Undead faction, obviously we've got the dock workers. What are their short-term, mid-term, long-term goals? Do they overlap with our players? Do they come at odds with the players? That sort of thing. And yeah, I think as well, I would probably do some more research on like the historical elements of it, certainly weaponry and stuff. I know, again, we're just doing this for fun. If I wanted to make this a thing, I'd probably go and do some research into that, maybe watch some various Gothic tales, maybe some actual plays as well, to really nail down what I want. But there you go. That is the world of the Isle. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I very much appreciate it. And we'll come back with some more actual plays. We've got some interviews coming up as well, which I'm very excited to get out. And the final thing to say when this comes out is that I will be at Gen Con at the beginning of August. I'm going there as part of Rowan Rook and Descartes, whose games you know incredibly well from Honey Heist, which is the first game we ever played on What Am I Rolling? And we've interviewed Grant, Maz, and Chris a long time ago now, and we did Die, the RPG, and we've done loads of their games. So now it is my honour that I'm going to go and do some work for them at Gen Con. Going to be a mixture of selling stuff on their stands as well as running some games, which I'm very, very excited for. So if you are at Gen Con, please come and say hello, and yes, check out all their stuff. Check out Die, for example. I'll be running 2 games of Die. I think they're sold out though, so unfortunately, if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, I'd love to go, too late. But yeah, I'll be around on the Rowan Rook and the card stands, so come check us out and come say hello and tell me what a great world I built. All right, thank you so much, guys, and we'll see you next time. Bye. The What Am I Rolling podcast was created, recorded, and edited by me, Fiona Howat. In this limited series, the player was me, Fiona. This limited series was 30 Days of World Building, an author's step-by-step guide by Angeline Trevina. You can find out more information about Angeline Trevina's work and grab your own copy of one of her world-building guides on her website, stepbystepworldbuilding.com. The theme music was 8-Bit March by Twin Musicon of twinmusicon.org, licensed under a Creative Commons 4.0 license. If you want to find out more about the podcast, check out the website. That's www.wairpodcast.com. Fancy getting in touch? Email the podcast at whatamirollingpodcast@gmail.com. Finally, follow the podcast on social media. You can find us at WAIR_podcast for the latest news on upcoming episodes. All the various social links are in the episode show notes, including Discord. And remember, adventurers need not apply.